everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Dee Laugesen, Executive Secretary for the Committee on the Present Danger China. We appreciate your interest in our weekly webinars in which we expose and analyze the Chinese Communist Party's unrestricted warfare against America and the help being provided to the CCP in waging that warfare by captured U.S. elites. We encourage you to visit presentdangerchina.org for information on new programs, access to videos of our past webinars, and tons of other very valuable content. Our moderator today is Frank Gaffney. Frank is the Executive Chairman for the Center for Security Policy and Vice Chair for the Committee on the Present Danger China, host of Securing America TV.
Welcome, everyone. We are joined today for a very important purpose, perhaps the most important of all, to assess the evidence that is now available that the Chinese Communist Party is prepared to move beyond the unrestricted warfare that it has engaged in for decades. Lines of attack, if you will, that we have documented extensively in the now more than 70 webinars we have performed and been proud to share with you all as part of this webinar series sponsored by the Committee on the Present Danger China. But now it seems there is evidence, if we have the wit and the will to look for it, that the Chinese are preparing for a new phase of this war, a shooting war. And that evidence is sometimes hiding in plain sight. It is sometimes something that you have to have a bit of expertise to ferret out. And in most cases, you need people with backgrounds relevant to making sense of what the intelligence community calls indicators and warnings, to understand just how grave the present moment is in terms of the prospect that the Chinese Communist Party is indeed not only a mortal enemy of this country, but one determined to translate its longtime aspiration to destroy the United States of America into action, potentially with truly catastrophic effects. We say all this not to terrify people into passivity or a fetal pose, but rather in the hopes that we can empower those watching this program, and especially your elected representatives and those appointed by your elected representatives, to act now, while we believe there may still be time to deter the shooting war the Xi Jinping regime has in mind for us, and, if necessary, to defeat their attacks should they come. We've assembled, as usual, an extraordinary group of participants to bring those kinds of skills to bear, to illuminate the evidence that's out there and to help interpret it and to give us specific ideas about what we must be doing now to try to have this come out as well as possible for us and, well, for freedom-loving people around the world more generally. We're going to begin this program with a pre-recorded commentary from our good friend Gordon G. Chang. He is well known to those of you who subscribe to these programs, and I encourage all of you to do so at presentdangerchina.org. You also know him, of course, from his appearances elsewhere, his books, including The Coming Collapse of China, his countless essays in places like Newsweek, the Gatestone Institute, Epoch Times, and elsewhere. But more generally, I think, because of his visionary, courageous, and indefatigable insights into the challenges of this day, including those we're speaking of today, I'm very pleased that he was able to join us, if not in person, via the miracle of videotape. We'll go to it now.
The committee for giving me the opportunity to talk to you. Now, Frank has asked me to talk about the mobilization of China's civilians for war. To do this, though, I'd like to have a little bit of context in terms of where the Chinese regime is going. And I want to start in October at the Communist Party's 20th National Congress. There, Xi Jinping gave a very dark speech to open that momentous event. And during that time, he received extensions. He got his third term to be General Secretary of the Communist Party, and as important, his third term as chairman of the party's Central Military Commission, which controls the military. At the time, it looked like he had total power, but we saw after that a number of events that suggested that his opponents inside the regime were actually making ground against him. But at the just concluded National People's Congress, Xi Jinping got his third term as president of the Chinese state. Now, this is a ceremonial post, but it's significant because it appears that by getting this and some other things that have occurred in the last 3 or 4 days, that Xi Jinping has actually consolidated power and that he has been able to rein in his opponents. This is significant because now Xi Jinping is not hearing any moderate voices that are restraining his thirst for military adventurism. And this thirst for military adventurism is fueled in large part by an extreme ideological antagonism he has for the United States. So that means that the words that we have heard recently have meaning. Now, at the National People's Congress meeting and at the twin meeting of China's top advisory party, Xi Jinping gave a very dark assessment of the world. Plus, he also, and this was unusual, he pointed out the United States and was establishing justifications for striking us because we had been constraining him, confronting China, all the rest of it. And then we also heard just today Xi Jinping's speech closing the session, which also talked about the Chinese military as being the protector of China, which we've heard before, but also in much more assertive language. This is in the context of a speech that the new foreign minister gave on March 7th, which which Qin Gang actually talked about how if the United States did not back down, there would, quote, surely be conflict and confrontation. And Qin Gang also talked about, quote, catastrophic consequences. And that is in the context in which we have to view what the Chinese regime has in fact been doing recently. You know, we all know that the Xi has been sponsoring the fastest and the largest military buildup since the Second World War. At the Communist Party's 20th National Congress in October, he appointed what is now called his war cabinet. Xi Jinping has been trying to sanction-proof his regime. And this is the subject of today's talk. We have seen Xi Jinping try to mobilize China's civilians for war. We go back to the first day of 2021. That's the day that amendments to China's national defense law went into effect. Those amendments took power away from the State Council, which is a civilian body, and they gave them to the Communist Party's Central Military Commission. And these amendments were facilitating the mobilization of China's civilians for war. Then on the first day of this month, China's new reservist law went into effect. And pursuant to that, the party is now establishing across the country what are called National Defense Mobilization Offices. So really what we're seeing is China putting together the infrastructure for mobilization of civilian society. In July of last year, a Chinese entrepreneur told me that, and he was making medical products for the civilian sector. This entrepreneur told me that Communist Party cadres had visited him and demanded that he convert his production lines in China away from civilian products in order to make products for the Chinese military. Communist Party cadres had been visiting other factories and also demanding that those private owners as well convert to military production. And in fact, this entrepreneur said that the party was now operating factories that once were privately owned, so many of them, because of these demands, that the factory owners just had decided that they were not going to stick around for what they called Xi Jinping's war. So we're hearing the war talk. We are seeing changes in the Chinese political system, and we're seeing what Chinese officials are in fact doing. And that puts into context all of these disturbing developments, because you will hear a lot of China experts who are extremely knowledgeable say, well, you know, all this war talk is just sort of bluffing. It's empty fortress, which is an allusion to a series of events in Chinese history where people just sort of bluff their way with war talk. But I actually think that now this war talk has meaning. We see China making great preparations to go into battle. And at the same time, we see in the U.S. a lack of sense of urgency and a lack of perception of what is happening inside China. And this is not just President Biden. This is also the 3 and 4 stars in the Pentagon and people across the American political system. And I'm talking about not only liberal Democrats, but also conservative Republicans. So we have failure across the American political system to understand what is happening inside China and why we must prepare as well. So I fear that there will be war between China and the United States. And I believe that there will be war unless something changes. And right now, I don't see anything changing. So we do smell war in the air, and we know that nothing good can come of this.
Gordon Chang, thank you. And you can follow Gordon at Gordon G. Chang, as I do, and I strongly encourage you to get the best of his thinking on a day-by-day basis through that vehicle. We are going to talk more, I'm sure, about some other considerations that are operating inside China at the moment, notably the very serious difficulties Xi Jinping is having with his own populace, demographics, economic, and the general discontent over the COVID pandemic, not the least. But that will be coming up shortly. In the meantime, we want to begin drilling down on some of the evidence of what the Chinese are doing that raises concerns about this not being simply an empty fortress bluff, but rather evidence of the sorts of preparations Gordon talked about that are very ominous indeed. For that purpose, we're going to begin with Ross Kennedy, a man who has graced these programs on a number of occasions, a terrific resource, particularly on issues that are not generally thought of as national security matters, food security, for example, the availability of fertilizer, the entire industrial capacity in this country to produce foodstuffs and the like. Ross is the driving force behind a terrific consulting organization, Fortis Analytics, and he has agreed to join us to talk today a bit about two symptoms of the war footing the Chinese Communist Party has embarked upon, the hoarding of various commodities, and sort of the flip side of the coin, the intensifying restriction of the export of many of them through supply chains upon which we were altogether too dependent. With that, we will hear from Ross by audio only, as it happens for the moment. We're very pleased to have him with us. Over to you, Ross Kennedy.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you all. You know, there is a Chinese proverb that says, may you live in interesting times, and I don't know that it's a proverb. Maybe it's intended more of as a curse, but we certainly do find ourselves in interesting times. And one of the really key understandings that we must have here is that China has become an enemy unlike any other, or an adversary, if you will, to the United States. It's the first really pacing adversary we had that has the ability to, overmatch us, to use a term that's become somewhat of a buzzword in the military in the last 15 years. but not just militarily. In some ways, they do have some technology that's more exquisite than ours, and others they're peers. In a lot of ways, they're not peer yet, but they are accelerating and gaining very rapidly across numerous domains. And those are the splashy ones. Those are the ones that think tanks like CSIS and some of the others will talk about as a measure of China's power relative to the United States. But for me, from my view, for a lot of people who have come to understand in really the pandemic and post-pandemic world, it's the logistics and the supply chains piece that really tell the tale of where the vulnerabilities are in the dynamic that has emerged between the U.S. and China as in the peer competition. And there's really three things that if you focus on those almost exclusively, you'll get to an 80% answer, not only on knowing what the risks are or what the opportunities are, but also what the future state looks like, because it's physical things that we can track. It's physical things that we can count. It's physical things that we know are moving or not moving that give us probably the greatest and most accurate and granular assessment of where any entity, whether it's a company, whether it's an individual, whether it's a country, is at. And that's food, water, and energy. Those are the three most basic things. If there was a Maslow's hierarchy of needs of geopolitical stability or geopolitical predictability, those three would be where we would begin. My particular specialty is in the food and water side. Water we've covered several times, and both here and within the committee, and you've seen it elsewhere. China's moves in India, Nepal, Tibet, all of that makes sense when you look at in the context of wanting to really monopolize the source of water for much of Asia, which is the Himalayan mountain range. But talking about food here, in particular, fossil fuel derived fertilizers, things like ammonium nitrate, things like urea, they have undergone serious restrictions to the point that we would probably categorize that as hoarding behavior, and have been doing so for about 2.5 to 3 years. Restriction of export into the global market, but also restrictions on sales and allocations internally within China across the provinces of who gets what, when, and where. They're doing the same thing with exports of fresh and frozen protein, grains as well. The one that's probably most concerning is that the United States, the West in general, with the exception of DSM and BASF in Europe, have allowed China to conquer and really corner the global market on synthetic vitamins. And these aren't just the kind of vitamins that we mix a bunch together in little Flintstone tablets. These are massive large-scale production of vitamin powders and granules that go into commercial animal production or commercial animal feed. It's mixed into the ration. Animals must have these. I do not encourage anybody to go looking for vitamin A or vitamin E deficiency in animals, what those pictures might look like. But it is an ugly picture in some cases, and in other ways, it dramatically blunts the competitive advantage that the United States has developed in terms of calories per capita that we have. China outproduces us on pork and chicken and others on raw kilograms, but their population is so high that the U.S. actually produces more calories from an agriculture side than any other country in the world. Without vitamins, though, that advantage on the animal protein side degrades to a place where we would be looking at anywhere from a 7 to 9x increase on meat, dairy, and egg prices if vitamin exports to the United States from China were restricted. About 90% of all the vitamins in the world are made there. It's a dirty process. It's one that gets sideways of, when it's not done correctly, it gets sideways of all manner of environmental laws that we have in the U.S. And so we don't do it here. We've allowed it to be outsourced. It's also very natural gas intensive, which is why BASF very recently announced plans to relocate large parts of their vitamin production from the corporate headquarters in Germany that's serviced by Gazprom natural gas to China. They didn't come to the U.S. with our abundant amount of natural gas or potential natural gas abundance. They went to China. So our own, one of the linchpins of our military security alliance in Europe, someone that we have been counting on to pull the weight, which they've not done economically or militarily for quite some time, but we largely have pretended as a matter of policy they have, chose to invest a multi-billion-dollar expansion of their vitamin production in China, not in the U.S. And BASF is telling us that's their bet on the future. Amino acids is the same. Amino acids are lysine, threonine, valine, isoleucine, D-L-methionine, the building blocks of life. Large parts of the global supply are also made in China, about 60% of global production. Most of these are derived from a fermentation process that's fed by corn milling. So the corn mills produce a sugar product like dextrose. It can be refined into high fructose corn syrup, or in its raw form, can be fed to bacteria that are genetically engineered to feed on sugar, and they excrete amino acids, whatever they're programmed to do biologically. Those amino acids are dried, they're packaged, powdered, and shipped around the world, and they are another essential component, just like vitamins, into animal feed. China of late has been very openly within the industry discussing what it will look like, not what it could look like, not if, when they begin the process of embargoing exports of amino acids and vitamins to the U.S. Two of the last indicators that show that China is moving more towards a war footing in terms of ensuring domestic availability of supply at the expense of the world and trade partners. We're starting to see unusual patterns of shipping activity related to ocean carriers, steamship lines, bulk vessels, bulk tankers. China is hoarding as much of the long-term charter capacity as possible. They're starting to build ocean vessels that are ostensibly for global maritime trade for large carriers like a Maersk or a COSCO, China's own massive state-owned enterprise that builds ships but also operates ship lines. But they're starting to build these under terms that allow China and Chinese lenders who pay for these multi-$100 million vessels that at any time if the operator or the charter party defaults on the agreement, they can be forced to move whatever or whenever or wherever as determined by the lender. They essentially seize control of the charter and force the company who is operating the ship that took the loan on the ship to carry what they want, where they want from the Chinese government side. We're also seeing finally an expansion of clearinghouse alternatives to SWIFT in the food and feed trades. And this would be from the China side, this would be CIPS, or the cross-border interbank payment system. It's a method of settling transactions, whereas SWIFT allows to denominate in certain approved currencies. It's a main sanction tool for the U.S. against Russia. As we've seen, it's probably not worked quite the way we'd hoped in degrading their ability to fund military operations in Ukraine and throughout Europe and Asia. CIPS has emerged as a way that non-U.S. allies or adversaries or neutral parties even are able to clear transactions outside of the U.S. dollar. The U.S. dollar is not going anywhere as the global reserve currency. It's still a phenomenally important tool of U.S. economic and trade and national security policy, but China is now providing an alternative, and they're slowly building their way towards that. When we take these things into account, what we see is a clear pattern, not only of manipulating markets for pricing purposes, as China has historically done, what we're also seeing is an ability of China to starve or make the cost of protein and food and energy so high for the West that if we don't engage right now, starting with this farm bill and a Defense Production Act-like version of reshoring of critical value-added agricultural, food, and feed production to the United States, we are very quickly going to be looking at maybe not a famine, but the most expensive on a per calorie basis we have probably ever seen food be in the United States. And that is not a storm we can weather politically or economically.
Ross, thank you. What a sobering analysis, as always, informing us about aspects of this challenge that are well beyond the kind of, certainly people like myself who've been focused on other pieces of the threat we face from China and the preparations for war in which they are engaged. I so appreciate your time, and I know you have to leave a little early. We hope to get a question into you before you do. Next up, we're going to speak to another of our very valued colleagues who has often contributed to these programs, in this case, once again, via video. His name is Charles Sam Faddis. He is a longtime intelligence professional, having served as a clandestine service officer in the Central Intelligence Agency. He's also been an Army officer and a senior official out in Washington State and its Attorney General's office. He has, among other things, run for Congress, written books, including Beyond Repair, The Decline and Fall of the CIA, and these days can be found producing incredibly important material at andmagazine.com on Substack. We're going to go to the videotape from Sam, whom we've asked to go into a little bit of detail about how is it that we seem to be missing, despite all of the money and talent that we have in the intelligence community, some of these indicators and warnings of what the Chinese are in fact doing to prepare for a shooting war. Let's go to Sam Faddis now.
When we start talking about the possibility of some sort of offensive military action by communist China, one of the things that troubles me is that I think we assume, without really being conscious of it, that we're going to have some sort of perfect clarity into what is unfolding, what Beijing's intentions are, what actions they're taking. At the heart of this, I guess, is this belief that this gigantic intelligence community that we have is collecting so much information that really we will have a full understanding of what's unfolding, and therefore we're going to be able to react and move and make decisions based on all of this incredibly detailed information. And I think that it's really dangerous to rely upon that assumption for at least a couple of reasons that I could cite. The first is it assumes that the state of our collection on the Chinese target is robust. And I'm not sure at all where the evidence is for that. I would trot out as Exhibit A to the contrary, everything concerning COVID-19 and the Wuhan lab, right? Biological warfare programs, any kind of dangerous biological programs that could become biological warfare programs, all across the world are absolutely top-tier collection targets for the intelligence community. There's nothing more important than that. The Communist Chinese are obviously our number one enemies on the face of the earth. The Wuhan lab, there are actually a couple of labs, but one of them is the only BSL-4 lab. In other words, top-tier lab in China, the kind of place where you can really play with and work with the most dangerous organisms. So you add all of that up, and it really, if you think about it, you should not have been able to sneeze inside the Wuhan lab back at the beginning of this pandemic without American intelligence knowing about it. Between human sources, hacking computer systems, technical collection, we should have had this place wired in every conceivable way. And yet, apparently, as far as we can tell, we got no warning whatsoever that there was an impending pandemic, or even that a pandemic had begun, really, until it was well underway. So we were apparently completely blind concerning a target that should have been absolutely at the very top of our list of priorities. So that's not particularly encouraging. And then we should note that 3 years on, the best we can get out of the intelligence community are these sort of lukewarm assessments that, yeah, with moderate confidence, maybe, probably, sort of, this thing started in that lab, right? So none of that should fill you with confidence that we really have penetrated the communist Chinese in the way that we need to have. Then we add on top of this the capacity for the Chinese to feed us disinformation and misinformation and engage in deception operations. There's nothing new about those. They're really old. They're as old as the intelligence business, which has been around forever. And we got lots and lots of examples of people all over the planet very effectively deceiving their opponents. We did this to the Germans in 1943 when we invaded Sicily, but we fed them all kinds of information in a whole variety of ways, saying we were going to invade Greece. We did it again on an even grander scale, 1944 D-Day, Operation Overlord. General Patton put in charge of a completely fictitious army, right? Complete with inflatable tanks and all of this stuff, all to convince the Germans that we're coming across the channel at a completely different location than, in fact, we did. So this kind of stuff is done all the time. It's done very effectively. The Chinese are really, really good at it. And if you combine those two things, their capacity to feed us a line, in effect, and then our weak collection, that should not leave you feeling like, yeah, this war is going to start with us understanding exactly what's happening and when it's going to start and so forth. In fact, I think very much to the contrary, what you ought to assume is that when and if we go to war with the Communist Chinese, it's going to look a lot like December 7th, 1941 or September 11th, 2001, right? It's going to be a complete surprise, and we are going to go from a standing start having already been hit.
Sam Faddis, thank you. Again, the voice of experience from within the intelligence community about certain shortcomings that are clearly well understood by the Chinese, and if they weren't taking advantage of them prior to the COVID-19 biological warfare attack, which is what our Team B3 has, I think, definitively described it as, they certainly have been doing it since. And it's very, very much of importance to us to not be under any illusion about our capabilities to avoid surprise. And all the more reason why we've got to pay attention to what are these indicators and warnings that are available to us. We're going to talk about some more of them in the economic warfare battle space with a man who is one of the country's preeminent experts on the subject. His name is Kevin Freeman, another committee Present Danger China member, and the host of a terrific television program entitled Economic War Room with Kevin Freeman. He has been an extraordinarily important contributor to the work of our Center for Security Policy as one of our senior fellows, and we're always delighted to have him with us to contribute to these programs. His latest book is called According to Plan. He may touch on some of the insights from that book and his response to the question of what else are the Chinese doing in the way of economic warfare that suggests preparation for something of a very different character, a shooting war. Kevin Freeman, welcome. It's good to have you back with us, sir. Over to you.
Thank you, Frank. And if we could echo on what Sam Faddis concluded with, can you imagine if it were 1936 or 1939 rather than 2023? Now, 1936 was the year my mother was born. It was the middle of the Depression. It was a dust bowl hitting my home state of Oklahoma. It was the year that the heat index record was actually set, even higher than any modern record. And that was before all the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now, if my mother had lived, she would be just 87 years old. So it's really not that long ago. And lots of people alive today were alive 87 years ago. That was a strange time, and it's strange to look back on. It's hard to believe, but corporate America was heavily investing in Germany, considered a European powerhouse. The Nazi Party was seen as fostering an economic miracle. The Summer Olympics were held in Berlin. Leading Americans applauded the discipline and focus of Adolf Hitler. I know it sounds strange now, but it was true then. In fact, there were many prominent Americans who supported the Nazis, and the Nazis had great influence in Washington, D.C., on college campuses, and in the boardrooms of American corporations. Nazi Germany received huge investments from Americans in 1936, second only to Great Britain, well ahead of France and any other nation. Now that seems really bizarre and strange. I share that though because it was a foolish thing to fund the Nazi war machine, and millions of people paid for it with their lives. It's also foolish to invest in any enemy with whom we know we will soon be at war. Can you imagine how those investors fared? Or how the companies that had grown dependent on Germany were crushed when war broke out? We were at war with Germany within 5 years of 1936. But according to Air Force General Mike Minahan, we don't have that long with China, maybe 2 years. Can we learn from history? What happens if we go to war with China next year or the year after? It was in 2013 that Xi Jinping rose to power. Shortly afterward, he made it official Chinese policy to de-Americanize the world. And that was written in an official CCP publication. They've been prepping for this for 10 years ago. 5 years ago, I published a blog series, Global Economic Warfare.com, with the title, The Winds of War. And it detailed just why and how we would soon be at war with China and also a proxy war with Russia. Here's a direct quote that I wrote in 2018. China has been prepping for a war footing. There are multiple clues that when pieced together, suggest a combination attack plan using economic pressure, technology, and physical invasion to assert Chinese dominance in Asia and ultimately over the planet. It is no longer acceptable to naively overlook this reality. Now, that goes on from congressional testimony I gave in 2016 when I testified with Gordon Chang in Congress, and I wrote, as Confucius supposedly said, there cannot be two suns in the sky. The goal under President Xi is to displace the United States so that China can take her rightful place, controlling at least 1/3 of the world's economy and overseeing the rest. Now, consider this from Zero Hedge on March 7th. They said, in an unexpectedly sharp escalation of diplomatic rhetoric, unexpectedly, China's foreign minister said that the U.S. should change its distorted attitude towards China, or conflict and confrontation will follow, while defending the country's stance on the war in Ukraine and defending its close ties with Russia. Let me translate that for you. He was saying, let us do what we want or we will start a hot war. And in his same speech, he threatened the U.S. dollar and he made clear their intentions for Taiwan. So let me ask this question. If it were 1939 and you knew what was about to happen in World War II, would you want to buy German goods or invest your pension with the Nazis? Sounds ridiculous, but that's exactly what Americans are doing right now with communist China. Some people estimate we've invested upwards of $3 trillion total when you count stock purchases, plus all the hidden ways that China extracts capital through the global index funds. Does this seem wise? The worst part is that we've been funding their innovation. As an example, consider last month's report from the Center for Security and Emerging Technology. They said, collectively, observed transactions involving American investors totaled $40.2 billion invested in 251 Chinese artificial intelligence companies, which accounts for 37% of the $110 billion raised by all Chinese AI companies. That's just for artificial intelligence. And 37% of the money invested came from deals involving American investors. And 91% of that's venture capital money that's not counted in the totals that I shared earlier, the $3 trillion. Bottom line, we're funding China to the tune of trillions of dollars in total, and much of that is helping China get ahead of us. It used to be China was relegated to imitation, but after stealing so much American tech and getting so much investment, they've nearly caught up and may soon surpass us. And that's what we see with artificial intelligence. The scary thing is that China is directly using these capabilities to expand their war machine. Consider the front page headline from Daily Mail this month. They said China increases its military budget by 7.1%, $230 billion to boost combat preparedness for major tasks amid fears it will launch an invasion of Taiwan. Remember, by law, every Chinese company must serve the CCP, and that means the People's Liberation Army as well. Thus, the defense budget can literally be any percentage of the economy that the CCP wants, regardless of the official numbers. And we're seeing the impact. Now we hear from Dr. Mark Mobius, perhaps the world's most famous emerging market investor, that he's unable to get his money out of China. Now, I worked with Mark when we were both at Templeton, and I even joined him on a research trip to China in 1999. Here's what he said. He said, I have an account with HSBC in Shanghai. I can't take my money out. The government is restricting the flow of money out of the country. I can't get an explanation for why they're doing this. They're putting up all kinds of barriers. They don't say, no, you can't get your money out, but they say, give us all the records from the 20 years of how you made this money. This is crazy. Mobius also said that the CCP has taken golden shares in every company to gain absolute control. That's just what the Nazis did. Now, I'm going to share with you 6 things that we should do at the national and international level. And if we work together, we can make a difference, because all of this points to a hot war. First, we must immediately put a brake on funding China. Full stop. Our friend Roger Robinson believes that this would rattle the shaky Chinese economy and win the war by itself. Roger directed Reagan's economic warfare team, so he knows what he's talking about. That means we've got to block the thrift savings plan from China, just like the Trump team did. But it also means we can't invest anything through index funds or even at the personal level into Chinese companies. At the personal level, you should watch Economic War Room, economicwarroom.com, and find a financial advisor who can help you get out of China. Now, on February 9th, according to the New York Times, the Biden administration said they had plans to curb investments into China. Well, that was great, but 2 weeks later, there were reports that the Biden administration is scaling back on any plans to reduce investment in China. Why? That's a huge mistake. We must sharply curtail and even pull back investments wherever possible. Step number 2, though, explains maybe the why. We have to root out, expose, and eliminate Chinese infiltration. We must listen to Peter Schweitzer. If politicians are compromised, they have to go. This includes President Biden. Congress better look at the Hunter Biden laptop because it certainly appears his family has been compromised by Chinese money. We have to shut down all the Confucius Institutes or any efforts by China to influence our college campuses. And we have to eliminate Chinese-funded research at American institutions. Number 3, we need to demand reparation from China for the way they handled the COVID pandemic. China won't pay, of course, but at least taking this step gives us the moral courage to push back elsewhere, and it could bring in allies. Number 4, in conjunction with steps 2 and 3, we must root out Chinese influence in international organizations like the World Health Organization, or we should pull entirely out of the World Health Organization. 5, because we know the Chinese plan to attack the dollar, we've got to strengthen it. This means we must develop a proper energy policy. We can no longer afford the pie-in-the-sky green energy policies that fund Chinese solar and wind companies. Instead, we have to build American pipelines and develop our internal energy, exporting as needed for allies. In addition, we need to draft a sensible budget and stick to it. We need growth policies while restricting federal spending. The Republicans have a plan for this, but we need that. Otherwise, the dollar will come under sharp attack. And we've seen what happened with Silicon Valley Bank. We need to correct this now. Finally, we need to follow the advice of that great Latin phrase, sivi pacem para bellum. Roughly translated, if you seek peace, prepare for war. This means we must build up our own defenses. We must also review our supply chains for industry and replace Chinese components, and it's not going to be easy. Overall, it's going to be a huge undertaking, and we haven't much time. But if China sees our resolve, we could actually avert war, but that means getting on a war footing now rather than remember peace through strength. It's time for that again. Now, you can learn more about this by watching Economic War Room. We cover this every week on our episodes. Thanks, Frank.
Thank you very much for a wonderful rendering of the problem and, as always, constructive ideas about what to do with it. I'm very happy to say that I think each of the ones you've mentioned are integrated into a new book that we've produced based on this webinar series entitled The Indictment, a basis upon which we can prosecute the Chinese Communist Party and its friends for war crimes against America and crimes of other kinds against humanity. This will be forthcoming hopefully next month, and we will keep you apprised as to how you can get it. For the moment, you can reserve a book at theindictmentbook.com. Kevin, again, thank you very much. We're going to go to our favorite cleanup batter to tie together what you've been told and put it into a bit more context about what we must do here if we are actually intent on deterring the Chinese Communist Party from waging war of the shooting kind against us in the first place. His name is Dr. Bradley Thayer. He is these days the director of our China program at the Center for Security Policy, a very highly regarded academic and scholar of China, the author most recently of or co-author, I should say, with Lian Chao-han of a terrific new book, Understanding the China Threat. He is prodigiously contributing to the public policy debate about all of this at outlets like The Hill and Epoch Times and many other places as well. We're delighted to have him with us always to especially help reinforce some of the most important takeaways from this conversation. Bradley Thayer, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Frank. It's a great pleasure to join you today and to also join my colleague in their evaluation. Gordon Chang, of course, did an exceptional job looking at really the civilian components and how the CCP, how the Chinese Communist Party is preparing for war by mobilizing their civilian structures. Ross did an equally commendable job in reviewing vulnerabilities that exist and how in food and energy and water, the CCP is really hitting Achilles' heels and issues that we haven't thought about for a very long time that are immediate and that we need to. Sam Faddis did his usual great job in really looking at the intelligence failures, causes of intelligence failures and their consequences. and Kevin's wonderful review of the economic elements. Many of the economic elements was alarming, of course, bracing, but nonetheless absolutely essential to think through why we're funding the Chinese Communist Party and how economic penetration has hurt us. What I'd like to do is focus on two major components that haven't been as addressed as yet, and that's the political and the military elements. Frank, you began the discussion by reviewing intelligence failures and the risks that are associated and indicators that we may receive. Much of the conversation today is centered around strategic indicators of attack. And these are indicators that, if you will, are deeper causes or deeper indicators rather than tactical indicators. For example, that a missile is on its way to Taiwan or to the United States. These are the CCP's efforts to lay the foundation, to lay the groundwork for the attack. And we see innumerable indicators, strategic indicators of an attack, as Gordon has addressed, and Ross and Sam and Kevin have as well. What I would like to do is look at the political first. The political elements are, what is the CCP doing with respect to allies and with respect to its messages? So we can see that the CCP is employing its allies, now Russia, to occupy NATO and the United States in Ukraine, and is working assiduously with Russia to establish markets, obviously, for Russian energy, for Russian economic goods, but also to support Russia militarily in the combat, in the war with Ukraine. So Russia serves a very important political purpose for the CCP. Iran does as well. We have witnessed in the last few months, Xi has been very active in the Middle East, going to Saudi Arabia, to some degree working with UAE and with Iran, importantly. And we see Xi attempting to establish, of course, as Kevin would certainly note, to eliminate the petrodollar, but also to ensure energy supply, that China will have secure energy supplies from Russia, but also from the Gulf Sheikhdom, Saudi Arabia, and most importantly, Iran. So he's working with his allies to establish that foundation very importantly. He's also working with allies in South America, elsewhere in Latin America, and in Cuba, and cartels in Mexico to undermine the United States, the population, but also undermine American security in the Western Hemisphere, as well as globally. Moreover, as a result of the National People's Congress that we have had this week, and his speech Wednesday, that would be March 15th, where Xi Jinping introduced his idea of the global civilizational initiative, both at the National People's Congress and with the announcement of the global civilizational initiative. Xi Jinping is making China's effort to set the new strategic narrative for the future, to set new norms, principles, the rules of the road in international politics, which he's seeking to advance, to take that away from the Anglo-American order that was established at the end of World War II and that served us extremely well in the Cold War and after. Xi is remaking the rules of international politics and of international organizations, and he's trying to bring CCP control over all of those elements. And Frank Gaffney and so many others have done great work in illuminating how the World Health Organization is operating as a pawn for the Chinese Communist Party. So we can see strategic indicators both in allies, but also in terms of how he's reaching to global audiences to make the case for China's dominance, which will be very valuable in a competition with the United States, a war with the United States. He's saying the future belongs to China. It no longer belongs to the United States and its allies, which again is preparing the battlefield in a strategic sense for the conflict that's coming. In a military sense, what do we witness? We witness very alarming events. Most importantly, and I'll focus on Taiwan, and on the U.S. Efforts. On Taiwan, we have witnessed the routinization of Chinese military exercise opposite Taiwan, violations of Taiwan's airspace as well as sea space, through, again, a routinization of exercises, of violations, to ensure that when the attack does come, and it is certain to come, that there is as little tactical warning as possible. Surprise is maximized. The cutting of the undersea cables in Matsu, for example, a small island off of Taiwan's coast, closer to China, of course, is another indication of how China is preparing the battlefield to cut off the ability of Taiwan to communicate with the rest of the world, so that the CCP is able to maximize surprise. With respect to the U.S., General Minahan's memo at the end of January of this year, when it was released publicly, leaked, and then released later publicly, is telling. As Minahan argues, 2025 is the year of conflict, which he anticipates, because in October, at the 20th Party Congress, Xi, in essence, laid the groundwork for his subsequent term, and he established his war council, Minahan noted at that time. Additionally, in 2024, Minahan argued Taiwan has presidential elections and the U.S. does as well. So that will compound our ability to respond as well as Taiwan's. So Minahan made the case that 2025 would be the year of the invasion. I think that's a good indicator. It certainly may come sooner than 2025 as a result of Xi Jinping's motivation to conquer Taiwan as part of his larger plan of dethroning the United States, of ejecting the United States from its position as the dominant state in international politics, the dominant state that has created world stability, a world economic order, and an international order that recognizes the freedoms of all people around the world. The order that China is creating is the opposite of all of those elements. The Chinese communist behavior, the behavior of the Chinese Communist Party is defined wherever it is present by exploitation of people and the environment. So we're seeing in the political realm prodigious changes as he sets the battlefield, and then in the military realm as well, with Minahan's the actions against Taiwan, with Minahan's memo, and the spy balloon, of course. The spy balloon was a sign, a component of political warfare against the United States, which was not only collecting intelligence against important targets in the U.S., but signaling the American people and the American government that he will hit the homeland through ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, hypersonic missiles, COVID, as we have witnessed. There are many avenues to hurt the American homeland, the American people. But the spy balloon was an indicator that the CCP is targeting the American people for destruction in their war. And it was a very important reminder of his intent. Well, in conclusion, Frank, when we review the military and we review political components, in conjunction to what my colleagues have already addressed, we see that in every area, in every realm, the CCP is preparing for war against U.S. allies, U.S. partners, and against the United States itself. And it compels all of those actors, Taiwan, India, key allies like Japan, Australia, our NATO allies, as well as, of course, of the United States, to prepare for conflict and to prepare for conflict today, military conflict against the CCP. My colleagues have underscored that the CCP has been at war for us against the United States since it came to power in 1949, and we should certainly recognize that war is going to take kinetic form and will do so very readily and far sooner than many individuals might anticipate as a result of Xi Jinping's determination to destroy the United States and the order that it created. Thank you very much indeed, Frank.
Thank you, Brad. An exceptional job, as always. And thank you especially for doing such a nice job of summarizing what we've heard from our other colleagues as well as making your own key points, of course. Ross, you've inspired a very interested and animated chat room conversation about getting nutrition as a result of the sorts of things that you've described may be soon lacking here that we rely upon incredibly from the Chinese Communist Party. The question was put, is there much that can be done, if not to onshore the kinds of capabilities that you've described as needed, at least friendshoring, I think was the term somebody has introduced to me, those amino acids and vitamins and other things that are so critical, as you made clear, to our agricultural production and indeed our competitive position in that regard?
That's a good question, Frank, and I think it's the obvious one of what can we do? And then from what can we do, we move to what should we do? We do have the ability to do vitamin and amino acid production in the U.S. In fact, the United States does do amino acid production now, just not at a large enough scale, given the enormous scope of our protein consumption and thus the amount of animals that we produce for food ingredients. An amino acid production facility in the United States, most famously to this group, at least, Fufeng Group, and tried to establish in North Dakota. And I was probably the early leader of that project of trying to get that lift off the ground in D.C. and then get people to understand what the threat was. And then thousands of people literally came together to stop that. That was the good and right thing to do. But it also exposed the question of why did they choose to target amino acid production in the U.S. as a way to incept or get their foot in the door near a military installation? And the obvious answer is that while building one in Grand Forks doesn't make sense, we do need a lot more of this production in the U.S. As I said in my piece earlier, really all you need is a corn mill and then a relatively small fermentation capability. Conceptually, this is not much different than like a distillery that you would make a whiskey or bourbon or vodka in. It's something that we know how to do. It's technology that the Japanese pioneered many years ago that was transferred to us, that Cargill and Archer Daniels Midland and others know how to do here in the U.S. There's 6 or 7 of these production facilities in the U.S. We can do more. What we need to do, though, is create a regulatory and economic environment that doesn't incentivize the same oligopoly structure that we've seen within large-scale agribusiness. Vitamin production is very much tied to the petrochemical industry. Almost all vitamin production is synthetic in origin and comes from a derivative of petrochemicals. Those are a little bit more, those facilities are a little bit more expensive to build. They're a little bit more time consuming to build. You'd have to deal with extra levels of permitting compared to a corn mill. But fundamentally, something we very much know how to do as well. 24 to 36 months from first permits to, flipping the switch and producing product for vitamins. 12 to 18 months for anything that is built onto an existing corn mill for amino acid production. These are things we do know how to do. And things that we should do. The best and fastest way to get to that is to create an incentives, like I said earlier, maybe a DPA, Defense Production Act, like provision for some of these technologies in the next Farm Bill. It would be great to see the Farm Bill move away from just being the same old three-legged stool of social welfare programs and rural welfare programs, if you will, as well as crop revenue protection. I'd like to be able to see that used as a way to jumpstart innovation and jumpstart production, and not by the same old, special interests that have already kind of co-opted the process for King Corn and others. Would like to see less ethanol, less biofuel, and more of that pulled towards value-added production we can actually put in our bellies.
Congratulations on your very significant contribution to ultimately defeating the effort by the Chinese to put Fufeng into that near backyard of one of the most important military installations in the country up at Grand Forks. And for work that I know you're doing now to try to help state legislatures prevent this sort of thing from happening in their states in the future. If I could ask you one more quick question, just to clarify, are you, when you said, and it's really quite stunning, that the large ships that the Chinese have constructed for Maersk and others can be essentially commandeered by the Chinese Communist Party at will, does that mean that essentially whatever happens to be on those ships is also going to be delivered to wherever they want it to be, presumably back to China?
Well, when you're talking about international maritime law, admiralty law, it gets very, very, very hazy. So it comes down to what the specific terms are, the finance agreement and the charter party agreements. It also comes down to the nature of maybe if there was a default, if we saw an overnight collapse like we did with Hanjin back in 2015, the large Korean entity. The bigger concern here, though, is that you would see a mechanism where if a company began, we would say, CMA CGM, the mega French carrier that actually absorbed here a couple of years ago, American President Lines, which is once kind of the shining jewel of the American merchant fleet. But if you took CMA, one of the largest ocean carriers in the world, and they're manufacturing most of their ships in China at this point, if CMA were to ever come into default against the Chinese banks that are lending and underwriting that, and where those banks are collateralizing the charter party agreements and essentially saying the value of the ship is not just the iron, but against the commerce that it produces, against the value of that traffic that it generates in, then we will essentially lien that collateral by forcing you to change your charter party agreement, or we can dictate to you as the lender what you would be carrying or the terms and conditions under which you operate the vessel. So that's a very sneaky, insidious sort of thing. We have seen it in small ways in the past, but that would be the type of thing where, for every ship built in China, which they're outpacing the rest of the world combined at this point in terms of tons of steel laid on the whole side, you would be talking about a fleet of ships that could very quickly be repurposed and turned into conveyance systems for whatever China deemed, whether it's their own product that they manufacture and they want to start favoring that, or, something maybe a little bit more sinister.
Yeah. Military, among other things.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Again, we appreciate your time, Ross, as well as your insights. I want to also acknowledge the great work that you've been doing on trying to help us understand the vulnerabilities of our food production system, and including the substantial numbers of companies in that space that have had fires, airplane crashes into their facilities and the like. It's taken altogether a very, very daunting question of the adequacy of our food production for the future. It's a subject to which we'll return with you shortly. Let me turn, if I could, Brad Thayer. We've had in the chat room the contention made now repeatedly that while you say that there is now no doubt that the Chinese are preparing for kinetic warfare, shooting war, if you will, that actually this is athwart the traditions of China, going back to Sun Tzu, who said it's better to win without fighting. And a lot of what the Chinese have done to this point, maybe this is a question of, to some extent, buying into the idea of the empty fortress. But could you just walk through with us why you think this option now is not only apparently available or becoming more so by the day, but one that Xi Jinping actually is prepared to exercise, notwithstanding strategic doctrine and history of China going back to the imperial days?
Certainly, Frank. 3 reasons. First, intent. Secondly, capabilities. And then thirdly, empirical evidence. So first, intent. Xi Jinping has expressed, my colleagues have addressed this from a variety of perspectives, but Xi Jinping has stated his determination to conquer Taiwan, and secondly, his determination to overthrow the United States and the order that the United States has created, including our alliances, our alliance networks. So our enemy has the intent. It's rare that your opponent, your enemy, tells you that he's going to attack you, but Xi Jinping, in fact, is doing this. As Air Force General Minahan's memo really has underscored, let us hope that, as General Minahan mentioned, and Admiral Davidson and Admiral Richard, and some other very distinguished and high-ranking military officers have identified, there's considerable danger of attack, of war. Secondly, capabilities. Capabilities of China, of the Chinese military, have grown incredibly. Every year it has gotten worse in the naval realm, Air Force, of course, and for the Army. Their force has professionalized increasingly. Their cyber capabilities are now first rate, and they're strategic. Their nuclear capabilities, both in terms of nuclear infrastructure, the ability to make nuclear weapons, the ability to maintain nuclear weapons, and then the ability to deliver them through bombers, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and hypersonics. We're witnessing tremendous growth in the Chinese arsenal and delivery systems on mobile intercontinental ballistic missiles, but also many hundreds of new silo-based weapon systems that would be intended, of course, to target and destroy the United States. Thirdly, succinctly, empirical evidence. What we're witnessing, of course, is that China is pushing against the Indians. They have killed Indian forces on their disputed border, and that's a source of constant tension. In the South China Sea, we're witnessing, of course, expanded Chinese presence against essentially freedom of navigation operations and the law of the sea in the South China Sea, with tremendous abuse against our the Philippines, of course, and Vietnam, Taiwan, and other states. Next, Taiwan, of course, as I mentioned, Japan, attacks on or essentially vectored exercises that are precursors of attacks in the East China Sea against U.S. and Japanese targets. And then, of course, recently, January, of the Liaonang's exercises, not only in the East China Sea, but also against Guam. So what are we seeing? We're seeing that in the Indo-Pacific space, China is very aggressive at pressuring allies against U.S. partners and, of course, against the United States itself. And as I mentioned, and lastly, the balloon, again, is a political warfare indicator that the American people are not free from attack, that if war comes, the CCP is determined to use military force to kill Americans in the American homeland, not just through fentanyl, not just through COVID, but through kinetic means against the American people. So intent, capabilities, and evidence are all pointing in the direction of bellicosity and an immediate bellicosity. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you, Brad. That's very well said, of course. And, you know, again, at the minimum, we can't afford to ignore any of those factors, let alone the convergence of all three. Kevin Freeman, I want to draw you, if I may, into what seems to be a little bit of a controversy between you and Ross about one particularly troubling line of attack in the unrestricted warfare space. You've studied this closely. You've been warning about it on your program, in your writings, and elsewhere for quite some time. Namely, the effort the Chinese Communist Party are making is, as you've mentioned, to displace not just the United States, of course, but the dollar as the reserve currency of the world. I think Ross indicated it's not going anywhere anytime soon. There are clearly efforts underway to bring that time closer. Why do you think the argument is just really a matter of time, not something that we'll see sustained for the foreseeable future?
Yeah, well, Frank, first off, the digital yuan is something that they've pursued, and it is intended to replace the dollar. They have spoken very plainly that it's their goal and position to replace the dollar. In 2008, Vladimir Putin had that position, and the Chinese rebuffed him. They did not join him in attacking the dollar. 2013, they came out very publicly and said, we want to replace the dollar. They've built up this, and I think it was referenced, the SWIFT system is no longer being used. They use the SIP system. the Chinese international payment system instead of the SWIFT system. And they have been preparing for the day that we would use sanctions against them, just like the Russians did. And you can see our economic weaponry against Russia is not nearly as effective as we thought it would be, because they have separated their economics in large part from the Western systems. So I have no doubt that they want to displace the dollar. They see it as a massive means of American power, and they want to remove that means of American power. And they can do it quite easily now. We've made it quite simple for them. We had $18 trillion in debt when I warned, I guess in the year 2016 for the state of Utah, we had $18 trillion of reported public debt. Now we have $32 trillion of federal debt. Some of that's intergovernment debt, but we've grown our debt rapidly. They've pointed it out. They're undertaking cyber attacks. There are suggestions that they may have been involved with Silicon Valley Bank in some way. I don't know that. I haven't seen the data. I do know that the Pentagon is having to reach out and fix things now because Silicon Valley Bank was funding a lot of their tech operations that a lot of our military depends on. So as a result, they understand our financial system can easily be attacked. One of the phase 3 that I talked about in 2008 would be an attack or a run on the U.S. dollar. And when you see runs on the bank, and you see a dollar with the debt that we have, and you read unrestricted warfare, it becomes pretty plain that their intention is at one point or another to try and replace or displace the dollar. They know that if we get into a shooting war and they are dependent on U.S. dollars, they understand that we could cut them off economically, and they've prepared for that for 10 full years. De-Americanize China and then de-Americanize the world by de-dollarizing the world. So I have no doubt that that's a part of their unrestricted warfare plan. We see plenty of evidence. We see it in the actual Chinese language papers that you can translate, and it's been there for the past 10 years. They've been saying the best weapon they have is to remove the dollar as the world's reserve currency.
And how does that bear, if at all, Kevin, on their continued reliance on dollars as investments in China to underwrite much of their, among other things, malevolent activity?
Well, it's like Hotel California. Mark Mobius said it. You can check in, you just can't check out. Of course they will take every dime they can get, just like the Nazis did up until they invaded Poland. The Chinese Communist Party wants to get every single dollar in that they possibly can while they can. And then once that they've gotten those dollars and put them to work internationally or however they're using them to build up their military or whatever, they're not going to let you take your currency out. So yes, they're playing a twofold game. There's no question about it. But their ultimate intention is to break the American economy and destroy the United States as a world superpower.
Yeah, I think there's very little doubt about that, certainly coming out of this conversation. Ross, let me give you an opportunity to respond. Do you find anything disagreeable in what Kevin said, or do you largely concur?
Yeah, I'd say there's a lot that's really accurate about what he's saying, and where I think I see this going, and far be it for me to attempt to supersede anything that Kevin would be saying about the economy or money. The man is an absolute wizard. My view is simply from the perspective of, to the extent that China can co-opt and force people into transacting business in their currencies, they will do so. To the extent that they're forced to denominate transactions maybe in a purchasing country's currency, whether it's India or Saudi Arabia, they will do so, because at the end of the day, getting access to whatever the physical thing is or transacting the business is of paramount importance to them. I do agree that the movement, the idea is to erode the U.S.'s dollar and erode full faith and confidence in the dollar as the primary means of transacting business in the world. What I am betting on when I say I don't think that the dollar will break as the global, as the global currency, as the reserve currency of the world, is that at the end of the day, there are still enough people that are dependent upon, or enough countries that are dependent upon the U.S. economy for some of the things we do singularly well. And I will not bet against the almost unique American ability to walk right up to the edge of the abyss, teeter, nearly topple in before righting ourselves and finding our way back. I'm betting that we will find ourselves as a country again, that we will become, in a lot of ways, what we once were before the faith in our ability to do that breaks. But from a technical side, from a, all hands on deck, the enemies against the U.S., 100% agree with that. And it's a 50-50 proposition at best that my analysis is correct when it comes to that.
Yeah. Well, as they say, from your lips to God's ears on us teetering and coming back from the precipice. Brad, I wanted to come to you on a point that you made that is very near and dear to my heart at the moment. You mentioned some of the work we're doing on the World Health Organization. I was really struck by the emphasis that she placed in this concluding speech at the National People's Congress just concluded about this idea that there's going to be at China's hands a reform and development of what he called global governance. Clearly, what the Chinese have done to penetrate and to dominate, as you've indicated, these international organizations is enormously helpful to them in recasting the world order or formalizing changes to it, including this idea, amazingly, of having the World Health Organization, despite its appalling conduct in the COVID-19 context. And I've just seen in the chat a report that the Surgeon General of Florida, Dr. Labadeau, has indicated that the vaccines that came out of all of that have a, quote, terrible safety record, unquote, which is an understatement, but a welcome one just the same. But Brad, the idea that this organization would be entrusted if the Chinese Communist Party and the World Economic Forum and the bureaucrats, of course, at the World Health Organization and the Biden administration have their way would be to essentially have this entity dictating not only what constitutes a public health emergency of international concern, but dictating how it will be responded to by Americans and others. An unbelievable affront to and diminishing of our sovereignty and our personal sovereignty as well. We've done a really superb, the last webinar of this series was breathtakingly impressive in this regard. And I, again, commend it to everybody watching. If you haven't seen it, please go to your subscription at presentdangerchina.org to see what we talked about in that context. But Brad, your thoughts more broadly about how the United Nations, the World Health Organization, well, for that matter, the World Economic Forum and other entities like this are handmaidens, if you will, for the Chinese takeover of the planet, as well as defining the governance structure by which they will rule.
Oh, absolutely, Frank. And just on that point, the work that you've done and our colleague Reggie Littlejohn, her work has been incredible, really, on this issue. Anyone who's interested can go to the locations that you identified. China made the decision, of course, to get rich because we let China into our economic ecosystem. China determined to work within our international institutions, the ones the Anglo-Americans created, subvert them, take them over, while at the same time generating their building new institutions at the same time. And so what we're witnessing really are the fruits of that strategy. And it's remarkable, first, that Tedros still has, essentially is still in position at the World Health Organization when he worked hand in glove with the Chinese Communist Party at the outset of the COVID pandemic to suppress information, to accept what the Chinese were telling him, and to spread that disinformation. For example, with respect to how the virus essentially was communicated. And yet this fellow is still in charge. This man is still in charge. It's simply outrageous. And they have moved on to the next step, Frank, as you mentioned, where you're going to have essentially a social credit score will be in place under the guise of the WHO and the efforts to fight, or the purported efforts to fight pandemics, which is completely circumventing the democratic process, how we acquiesce to treaties in the United States. Signature and ratification, of course, are completely. And, of course, not calling attention to that this is happening so that people will go along with it. The American people, I think, are largely unaware that these activities are happening and the profound consequences associated with them. So the WHO is kind of the poster child of what the CCP is trying to do, but we can look in every area. We could look in aspects of meteorology, or we can look at aspects of in the economic realm, in the political realm, how great organizations, for example, the WTO are being subverted, or the World Health Organization, or the Outer Space Treaty, for example, how China is essentially flaunting that, violating that with its activities in space, on the moon, and likely activities to Mars. So it's an outrageous situation, and it's time that we have leadership to identify this and to enlist international opinion and the opinion of the American people and free peoples around the world to stop it, and to encourage everyone around the world not to enter into Chinese organizations or Chinese-controlled organizations like the Belt and Road Initiative, because any interaction with the CCP is going to result in exploitation of the individuals concerned and the environment in which they operate. Frank, thank you very much.
Thank you, Brad. I'm so glad you mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative. You talked about our own hemisphere, but it's truly globally now that this colonial infrastructure has been put into place. And I think indisputably, it will change the character of the next war, if there is a shooting war, from one that we might have thought of in World War II as being global, into one that will be even, well, orders of magnitude more so, if some 147 different countries are bent to the will of the Chinese to help them project power against us and our friends, such as they are. Kevin, let me ask a last question of you. There's news as we speak that the administration has finally, commendably, albeit very belatedly, come around to the position that Donald Trump had enunciated before he left office, that TikTok needs to either be removed from the Chinese ownership that makes it a weapon for the Chinese Communist Party in its warfare against us, or simply be banned outright. And I just wanted to ask you, in the context of this preparation of the battle space, if you will, for how they will fight us should it come to a shooting war, to talk a little bit about the implications of this seemingly innocuous platform for silly dance videos, mostly, has become an instrument for propagandizing young people in this country into believing that not only is their country not worth, defending, but actually that the preferable system by far is that of the Chinese Communist Party. Your thoughts on that, sir?
Yeah, well, this little device here, a cell phone, has become the greatest spy device in the history of humanity. It has the ability to listen in on your conversations. It has the ability to monitor all the things that you look at. It knows exactly where you go. It knows what you like and what you don't like. Now, that last aspect, if you take the idea that you can understand what any person, including a young person, likes or dislikes, you can then form messages that will lead people. And Dr. Robert Epstein he was the head of psychology today. He's a friend of mine, and he published on this. Just by giving you certain search engine results, Google can manipulate and control elections. And I think that's kind of beyond dispute. Now, if you have TikTok, having watched the cat videos that you're looking at, but also seeing everything you like and dislike, what you linger on, what you don't linger on, they can then manipulate you with some very sophisticated artificial intelligence algorithms, some of which, as I said in my presentation, we are funding, then they have the ability to literally manipulate the American people. We don't let foreigners own our radio stations and our television stations for a reason. And yet, most people are getting their news and information from this little device. And so TikTok, being the most popular app there and having captured America's youth by storm, and a lot of other people as well, becomes a potential spy device that can monitor you, control you, impact you. And so, yes, it's about time that the government look into this. President Trump started this process, but both sides of the aisle, Democrat or Republicans, recognize the manipulation capability from a popular software like TikTok. And if it's in Chinese hands, and if they're gathering that data and putting it on Chinese servers, and I know they're doing desperately trying to protect their position. Oh no, we'll switch it to American ownership. Oh no, we won't let the data go to China, and so forth. The simple fact of ownership is an indication to me that this is a part of Chinese unrestricted warfare. Now, I don't know ByteDance and TikTok. I don't know what's in the heart of those individuals, but I do know how dangerous it is to let them have control over a spy device that reaches every American.
Yeah. And I think, as you said earlier, Kevin, there is no company in China, certainly not the state-owned companies, but not the private sector ones nominally, that is immune to the dictates of the Chinese Communist Party, pursuant to law and obviously the coercive power of the CCP. We are deluding ourselves if we think that an instrument like this, whether it's actually literally owned and operated by the Chinese Communist Party or whether it's got somebody else nominally in charge, but the data stream still sliding to China, will be anything other than a weapon in the hands of our enemies. And I think, if nothing else, the takeaway from this incredibly impressive presentation, as each of our contributors have helped round it out, is the Chinese are deadly serious about war against this country, deadly serious, deadly committed to eliminating our nation. They will do it without fighting if they can. Perhaps they will use biological warfare, which they have already done, to complete the job. Perhaps they will go to the old-fashioned, horrific, violent, kinetic kind of warfare. But whatever it is, we are on notice. They're not only thinking about it, but they are actively preparing to do all of that. For us to ignore this, for us to pretend that it's just empty fortress bluffing, is to invite disaster. And our Committee on the Present Danger China certainly is committed to averting that. We thank each and every one of you who have been listening to this program and who will, I pray, take this video when it is posted shortly and disseminate it widely within your circles of influence. Call attention to it, and most especially press your elected representatives to take aboard its content, because they work for you, and we need them to be attending to these sorts of problems in the hope that we can avert war by being resolute, as has been mentioned, by being prepared and deterring effectively what the Chinese have in mind. I'm going to close with that. This is Frank Gaffney. I so appreciate your being with us, and I will turn the floor back over to our colleague, Dee Loggeson.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you to all of our panelists. I want to extend a thank you as well to my colleague, Oleg Atbashian, who helps me in the background produce these webinars. A video of this webinar will post to presentdangerchina.org within a day of the conclusion of our program. Please share this and our other programs with your elected representatives, colleagues, and other networks. And join us again next week for our next installment of our Committee on the Present Danger China webinar series on the CCP's unrestricted warfare against America and the free world, and how the USA is betrayed by CCP-captured elites. Thanks for joining us today, and goodbye.